let's talk about 4 ways to sound more American when you speak English. Have you ever been watching an American movie and thought, it would be great if I could sound like Tom Cruise? Well, today I'm going to give you some tips to help you make your pronunciation sound more like an American. And by American, I mean the United States of America. There are a couple things that we need to talk about. First though, what in the world is an American accent? Because a lot of people in the US have different styles of speaking. Here, I'm going to be explaining how to sound like the most general American accent, which is that of news reporters or Hollywood. When you think about Tom Cruise, this is the accent that I'm talking about. Of course, if you want to sound more American, you need to use American expressions instead of British or Australian expressions. And finally, the best way to improve your pronunciation to sound more American, or if you want to sound more British or Australian, is to shadow. And this means you're imitating word for word everything that person is saying. You're repeating directly after the speaker. The first way that you can sound more American is to change your T sounds to D sounds when they're between 2 vowels. Let's listen to a sentence that uses a lot of these.
In New York City, he wore an exciting sweater because that always made him satisfied. In New York City, he wore an exciting sweater because that always made him satisfied.
City, exciting, sweater. Here we have a T between 2 vowel sounds like I mentioned, and it's changing to a D. It's not a T sound. It is D. This also happens between words. So you heard that always, that always. This isn't always done, but it's often done when native speakers are talking quickly. We link together words by making the final T change into a D. That always.
In New York City, he wore an exciting sweater because that always made him satisfied.
The second way to sound more American when you speak is to use the colored R. What in the world is that? Well, it's in the middle of the word when there is an R plus a consonant. A consonant is any letter that's not A, E, I, O, U. So it might be RS, RD. Any word that has an R plus a consonant, it's gonna sound like Let's listen to a sample sentence that uses this a lot.
The first word that you learned is the one you heard the most. The first word that you learned is the one you heard the most.
Did you notice something in this sentence? There are a lot of different vowel sounds that change to sound like one sound. In the word first, there is an I. In the word word, there is an O. In the word heard and learned, there's E-A, but they all sound like This is the colored R, and it's really typical in American English. Heard. Let's listen to that clip again, and the same as before, I want you to try to imitate and shadow that pronunciation style. Test your pronunciation muscles. Try to sound like an angry dog. First. Word, learned. It sounds a little crazy when you're practicing, but of course when you're speaking with other people, you can tone it down. But it's good to exaggerate when you're practicing pronunciation because you're getting your muscles prepared, and then when they're already ready to use those sounds, it will feel more natural. Your muscles will know where to go, and then you can kind of tone it down and not sound so crazy when you're speaking with other people. So when you're practicing, don't worry about exaggerating. The first word that I learned.
The first word that you learned is the one you heard the most.
My next tip for sounding American is to include an ER at the end of your words. This is really typical in American English. So before I explain it any further, let's listen to a sentence that includes this a couple times.
In the letter he wrote, remember to water the flowers. In the letter he wrote, remember to water the flowers.
The ER at the end of the word. Water. Don't forget to water the flowers. Remember to water the flowers. And this is gonna really test your R pronunciation. Again, you really need to make sure your R's are strong and powerful. Remember to water the flowers.
In the letter he wrote, remember to water the flowers.
My fourth and final tip is a specific contrast with British English. It is the ending ARY. Again, we're talking about R because R is essential in English and it's essential in a lot of different languages. I think oftentimes the R is the most challenging sound in other languages because it's so integral. Well, in this case, ARY at the end of words is gonna indicate that in American English, we're gonna pronounce the full word. Library, secretary, military. Do you hear that ending? Airy, 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 library. We're gonna say the full word. Let's listen to a quick sentence that uses a couple of these examples.
At the library, the secretary read a book about the military. At the library, the secretary read a book about the military.
In American English, you're going to pronounce each of the final letters, A-R-Y, military. In British English, they often cut out the A. So instead of military, it would be military, military. That A is just gone. But in American English, each of those letters are pronounced.
At the library, the secretary read a book about the military. In New York City, he wore an exciting sweater because that always made him satisfied.
In New York City, he wore an exciting sweater because that always made him satisfied.
The first word that you learned is the one you heard the most.
The first word that you learned is the one you heard the most.
So when you're practicing, don't worry about exaggerating the first word that I learned.
First word to learn.